Okay, this is your first Philosophy of the Cosmic Dance meeting, and there'll probably be about 6 of them over your next few lessons on Tuesday evenings and some Sundays, I think.
Yes.
That's right. And what I'm going to do is I'm leading up to explaining the symbolism of the ceremony and the tradition that lies behind it. But before I can get there, I have to sort of go into some basic principles that are common to all mystical traditions. And then I'll gradually work my way towards the symbolism of the ceremony. And before I talk about the principles, this particular meeting, I'm just going to give you a potted history of this society and the different traditions which have come together to form this society, and the different sort of stories it's gone through in its journeys. And there's no need to take it too seriously, because whatever group you go to, whichever society, they've all got this sort of set of mythology and the particular stories of so-and-so did so-and-so and such. And it's important, in a way, to stay free of all that, so you don't become identified with a particular group story. But for the purposes of your training and knowing where everything's come from, it's quite useful. So this meeting, I'm just going to tell the story of Colet House. And it all begins in this society with a Russian writer called P.D. Uspensky. And he was active at the end of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. And his passionate study was really the study of consciousness. And by consciousness, he meant the awareness we have behind our thoughts and our feelings and our desires. So when you're thinking and when you're feeling, there's something totally still behind that which is aware that you're thinking and you're feeling. And that was really his definition of consciousness. And in the early part of the 20th century, he wrote a book called Tertium Organum, which was a very brilliant book. It's very hard to read because it's quite academic, and I'm not academic at all, but nonetheless I've waded my way through it a couple of times. And in that book he sort of explains that the universe as it appears can't possibly exist. And so he describes what I would call a wonderful non-dual model, so a unified model of ourself and the world. And that made him quite famous as a young man, and he also lived on the royalties from it. But he wanted to find ways by which ordinary people in daily life could access this deeper sense of self, or this consciousness which lies behind the change in psyche. So in the early part of the 20th century he set off on his travels, and he particularly went to India looking for what he described as methods. And during that time he also travelled in Turkey, and he visited the Mevlevi dervishes quite a lot, and he used to meet with some of the sheikhs and dialogue with them. And then when he was over in India, he hadn't really found what he was looking for, and then the First World War broke out, and he had to go back to Moscow, where he was mobilized into the army. And eventually I think he was demobilized because he was very short-sighted, so he went back to Moscow and St. Petersburg. And while he was there, he met a Greek teacher called G.I. Gurdjieff. Could you actually settle down, Khalid? Thank you. He met a Greek teacher called G.I. Gurdjieff, and for a while he thought he'd found what he was looking for in Gurdjieff's teaching. because it was, for him, it was something very different from what he'd come across before. And Gurdjieff had been out again at the end of the 19th century, visiting various schools in the Middle East and the Caucasus, and probably in Tibet, probably sort of the area around Kurdistan and the Hindu Kush and around then. He'd been gathering knowledge, and he'd also been collecting sacred dances. And so Gurdjieff set up a group of people around him in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and he taught what was sort of technically known as the system. And as I said, for a while Uspensky was very taken with the system, and he was a pupil of Gurdjieff. And when the Russian Revolution came along, and they had lots of adventures where they had to flee to different places, and for quite a while they were in Constantinople, as it was then. And eventually Uspensky managed to come to England, where he set up an organisation here, and he was able at a certain point to get hold of this house. He was able to rent it during part of the 1920s and the 1930s. So in the big room upstairs where you're doing your training, that was where Uspensky held his meetings during before the war, between the wars. And at a certain point he found it necessary to separate himself from Gurdjieff, and he started teaching completely independently. The reasons for the separation I'll gradually explain as the Cosmic Dance course goes on, but basically at first he strongly disagreed with Gurdjieff's methods, which could be quite violent, and in practice led to quite a lot of tragedies. And also, as Dr. Rolls later said, the need for happiness had been left out in Gurdjieff's tradition in his school. And Dr. Rolls explained to us, and I'll explain in a bit who Dr. Rolls was, that any true school gives its members three qualities, and in Sanskrit they're called Sat, Chit and Ananda. And Sat means being, so that's the pure being, what I referred to earlier as consciousness, the thing that lies behind your psyche, which never changes. Sat. And Chit means consciousness, so that's almost the awareness of the pure being, or pure self-awareness. And then the third quality is Ananda, or Anand, which literally translates as bliss. But it's not like intense ecstasy, it's more like a deep inner contentment or stillness that comes from the experience of your true being. And Dr. Earl said that any school should give its members those three qualities, and that in the school that Gurdjieff was teaching, the need for the Ananda had been forgotten. So it was, a lot of it was very unhappy, and a lot of the people associated with it were quite stern and forbidding people. So they started working independently, and Mr. Uspensky came here to London, and he had a big country house down in Surrey, which I used to go and visit when I was a kiddie, and not when he was alive. Later, I used to like to go and walk around the garden and visit Mr. Uspensky's grave in Surrey. And then he had this Colet House as his headquarters, and he'd carried on teaching and developing what he'd learnt from Gurdjieff, and also developing his own ideas as he'd written them up in Tertium Organum and other books. But back then they didn't really have any methods like we have now, so it was a lot of it was just sort of hard physical work with attention, and it was quite tough, and they often had to stay up all night and get up really early in the morning. And towards the end of his life, during the Second World War, Uspensky went across to live in America, where he, with Madame Uspensky, his wife, they had a big country house at Mendham, and again he carried on teaching what was known as the system. But as his life progressed, he moved further and further away from it, and in 1947 he came back from America, and he came back to England, and he said to Dr. Rolls, who was one of his main pupils, and another man, get me 300 people. So Dr. Rolls and this other man had to gather together 300 people, and then he held 3 large meetings, again up in the top studio here, with himself. He was up on the platform, and Dr. Rolls was just below the platform helping him. And at those meetings he totally threw everyone into confusion, because he said he abandoned the system, so he abandoned the teaching which he had been developing, that he had learnt from Gurdjieff. And that really threw everyone into total confusion, because everyone had got so used to the different metaphors that he'd been using. And privately, he prepared certain people, one of whom was Dr. Rolls, to go off and what he called reconstruct the teaching after his death. And one of his last words were, "Think for yourselves in the language of the future, don't hang on my soul." And when people talked to him in terms of the teaching he had been teaching, he just refused to talk about it, or said he didn't know what they were talking about. So it was like he saw something completely different, a completely different way of seeing it. And he said that he abandoned the system, and he wanted it reconstructed from the very beginning. And then he retired back down to Lyme Place, where there were lots of adventures, and then he died. And then people started to sort of go off in different directions. But Dr. Rolls, who was my teacher, had already had his instructions from Mr. Uspensky as to how he was to continue on this society and the use of this house. And at the time, the society didn't own this house, it was just rented. And various different people rented it. At one point, the Gurdjieff organisation rented it, and the Royal Ballet had it for quite a long time. And the founder of the Royal Ballet, who was a lady called Dame Ninette de Valois, who I knew because she was a member of this society, she managed to arrange for Colet, the members of Colet, to be able to buy this house in 1957. So after that we own it fully with a freehold. But after Mr. Uspensky's death, Madame Uspensky, who had always regarded Gurdjieff as her teacher, unlike Mr. Uspensky, who had moved on, published certain books under Mr. Uspensky's name, which I'm just going to show you for the record. And the most famous one is called In Search of the Miraculous, which details Uspensky's time as a pupil of Gurdjieff. And Uspensky never wanted this book published. It was published against his will after his death. And Dr. Rolls all told us that we weren't to read it. And me being a naughty boy, immediately read it. But I know now from experience what Dr. Rolls meant, but I'll go into that later. So that book's under P.D. Uspensky's name. he never wanted published. And there are other books at the same time. This one, called The Fourth Way, was a record of his meetings. And it's like, towards the end of your life, you often have a great realization. Then after you've died, it's a terrible shame if people go back to your sort of earlier writings when you've moved right beyond that into something different. So I'm just telling you this as part of the story and for the record. And while Uspensky was alive, he only actually authorized one person to teach the system, and that was a doctor called Maurice Nicoll. And Maurice Nicoll, after his death, his papers were published as this series of volumes called Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Uspensky. And again, just before Maurice Nicoll died, and there's a lady here called Annie Brunsden, who you might have seen. She's a lovely sort of big, radiant, bouncy lady who's just had her 90th birthday, and she seems to glow. And she was a pupil of Maurice Nicoll in the 1940s. And just before Maurice Nicoll died, he again abandoned what he'd been teaching. He said, "We've had a nice party, but we haven't gone far enough, so we mustn't continue." And then he said, besides, there's something much better coming. So, again, Maurice Nicoll wouldn't have wanted those published. And when Annie Brunsden saw that I'd got those, she was amazed. She said, "You're not reading those, are you?" So that, again, is another little part of the history. Maurice Nicoll did write some really lovely books on the interpretation of the Christian Gospels. There's one called The Mark and one called The New Man. That's The Mark and that's The New Man. And they're actually really nice. And there's also one called Living Time, which is really lovely about time. So that was Maurice Nicoll. So he was a lovely man by all accounts, but he realised the limitations of what he was teaching, and he advised that they didn't continue teaching it. And then another very close pupil of Uspensky's, who was a good friend of Dr. Ols's, was this fellow, Rodney Colin Smith. And he attempted to do his own reconstruction of the system that Uspensky had been teaching. And he wrote this and one or two other books. And they're a bit fantastic. And Dr. Oles said they were written after Uspensky's death on this great energy which is released when someone dies. And he said they're very interesting, but they can easily be disproved by experts in any of the fields. So again, Dr. Oles regarded this as not a proper reconstruction that Uspensky wanted. So that again is just for the record. It's interesting reading, but a lot of it's a bit fantastical. And there's this one as well called The Theory of Eternal Life by Rodney Colin Smith. This is an old sort of limited edition copy I got. Full of fantastic stuff, but limited. And again, just for the record, there was another pupil of Uspensky called, what is his name? I wrote it down somewhere. Colin Lucas. And he used to run meetings in London, and he was a good friend of Dr. Oles, but had sort of separated and gone in slightly different directions. And just before Dr. Oles died, he had a lot of Colin Lucas's papers in his house, and he asked them to be burnt, because again he said he was worried that after his death they might be taken as a reconstruction of the system, when in fact Dr. Oles said they weren't right. So I'm just saying that for the record. along with his other things, of the different things I heard in this particular process. So after Uspensky died, then Dr. Rolls carried on the tradition, and he started to set up his own school based a lot on what Uspensky had taught him. And as I say, partly they were in this house and partly they were used other properties, and that was through the 1950s. And Mr. Uspensky had told Dr. Rolls to look for a method that involved repeating one word. And the sort of essence of what both Gurdjieff and Uspensky taught was what they referred to as self-remembering. And by self-remembering, it actually means remembering that deeper sense of self that lies behind your psyche. So remembering that you're not just your thoughts and you're not just your feelings, but you're the great stillness which lies behind your thoughts and your feelings, and yet is common to all people. So that was the essence of the teaching. And Dr. Rolls' job was to go off and look for methods which would make the accessing of that deeper sense of self much easier. So in the 1950s, here at Colet, if any teacher came to London claiming to have a method, then they usually brought them into Colet and everyone would try the particular method to see if it was the particular one that Mr. Uspensky had asked him to look for. And lots of different people came along. For instance, there was something called Subud. There was Mr. and Madam Subud came along, and they had a particular method, and all the Colet people were trying it out in the top studio. And eventually Dr. Rolls realised, he said, it's not going right to the source of consciousness. It's much more something on an instinctive, physical level. So that experiment was discarded. Normally with each experiment, a certain amount of members of the society would go off with the particular teachers of that method. So you got a lot of little sort of breakups en route. And then in about 1960, the then little-known Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who taught a system of meditation, came over to England, and the Colet House members again met him at the airport and welcomed him, and all tried out his particular method of meditation. And Dr. Rolls realised that the very simple form of mantra meditation was exactly what Mr. Uspensky had asked him to look for. And Mr. Uspensky also said, if you find a method, you'll find a man of a very high level of being to guide you after I've died. And although Dr. Rolls thought that the Maharishi's method was what Mr. Uspensky had asked him to look for, he didn't feel that the Maharishi himself was the man that Uspensky had asked him to look for, because Uspensky had described and demonstrated to him how a very conscious person acts and behaves and carries himself. But then at a certain point, the Maharishi, Dr. Rolls, went over to India to study with him at Rishikesh. And while he was there, the head of the Maharishi's tradition came along to visit them. And that was someone called Shantananda Saraswati, who was Shankaracharya of northern India. So now I have to go back slightly in the Indian tradition, because this is all part of what's known as the Vedic tradition, or the Vedanta. And the Vedanta is the very ancient Indian tradition going back 4,000 or 5,000 years. It's almost a sort of root tradition in India. And you get these scriptures called the Vedas, which in themselves are fairly mythic. by mythic I mean they have lots of different gods, like Agni, the god of fire, and Indra, and so there's lots of things to do with the elements and the winds. And so that's known as the Vedas. And the teaching that follows the Vedas is known as Vedanta. So as it progressed over the next couple of thousand years, it became very what I call non-dual. So by the time you reach the Upanishads, which are part of the Vedanta, it's a very, very non-dual teaching. I'll get into non-duality in your next talk. Just take my word for it at this point. And so it's also about 2,500 years ago. You got the Upanishads were written, and you got things like the Mahabharata, of which the Bhagavad Gita is just a mere conversation. So that was all part of this tradition, which was going down in India through history, and it was becoming more and more non-dual. So if you read things like the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam, they're fantastically non-dual texts. And as time went on, this is again in India, it started to become a bit distorted. It started to become very much the domain of the priestly caste, and consciousness was described as something which was very remote. So you had to retire from life and become a full-time yogi and be celibate. And so consciousness is almost described as being up there somewhere, and then you've got life in the world down here somewhere, which was a bit sort of grubby. So it's like a dualism had been created, and it's almost like you've got both transcendence and immanence. So you've got consciousness, on the one hand, is transcendent, which means that you go inward and access the great stillness. And then on the other hand, you've got immanence, which is consciousness is present in absolutely everything you experience. But in India it had become one-sided. It had become that consciousness was just transcendent. So you had to give up life in the world and go into a monastery and become celibate, and then through yogic practices attempt to access this great stillness. So it had become the domain of the priestly castes, and that caused big sort of divisions. So about 800 years ago, two different schools arose. One was, there was this great teacher called Shankara, and Shankara is just really another name for Shiva, and he founded what was known as the Advaita school, also known as Advaita Vedanta. And the word Advaita actually translates as not two. So it's a fully what I call a non-dual school. And with non-dualism, as I said, consciousness is both equally transcendent and immanent. So you can both transcend, go into the great stillness, and you're fully active in life. So there's no separation. As the Buddhists put it, samsara and nirvana are one. So there isn't an external mechanical world here and a deep, profound, unified consciousness there. It appears like that, but in reality the two of them are exactly the same thing. And also at the same time, about 800 years ago, a school known as Tantra arose. And Tantra, the word Tantra literally just means a scripture or something rolled up. And again, Tantra teaches that reality is both transcendent and immanent. So that's why Tantra has a great emphasis on the senses and life in the world. So it's really seeing that everything is equally consciousness, everything is equally God. There's not a little bit of God up there and then a naughty, bad world down here. It's all the manifestation of the same thing. So Shankara set up 4 schools of learning back 800 years ago. So there was a northern Shankaracharya, a southern one, an eastern one and a western one. And then it carried on as a continuous tradition to safeguard this particular school. And so that was who Dr. Rolls met, was the Shankaracharya of the north. And he accepted Dr. Rolls as a pupil. And as Dr. Rolls was our teacher, then all of us were accepted as pupils too. So what had been the Gurdjieff Uspensky teaching then started, in the light of this new understanding, to be completely turned around. Because Dr. Rolls described how the Gurdjieff Uspensky system was what he called a bottom-up system. And by that he meant that you were sort of down here in a mechanical world, and by particular efforts you could climb and climb and climb your way all the way up to consciousness, which was up here somewhere. And for non-dual Advaita teaching, it was what Dr. Rolls described as a top-down system, where consciousness isn't a remote goal you climb up towards. Already everything is consciousness. Already everything is the manifestation of consciousness, and there's nothing outside of consciousness. In the bottom-up model, consciousness was remote and you were separate. With top-down, you are already the great oneness. It's just the only thing that needs changing is your attitude, because you don't know it. So it's just gradually a change of attitude takes place. So that was then where Dr. Rolls was at, and he was showing us how to sort of turn everything around. And because they'd been so brought up in the Uspensky Gurdjieff tradition, it was very difficult for people to move into a new way of seeing it. So it took a long time to sort of ease people into it. And so that was 1961, 62. And then for the next 20 years, Dr. Rolls had continued audiences with the Shankaracharya of the North. And then in 1963, remember I said how Mr. Uspensky had been visiting the Mevlevi sheikhs in Istanbul and Konya back before the First World War. There was one of the Colet members, who was a lady I knew called Pat Graysbrook, and she had a farm down in Hampshire, and she had a Turkish boy working on her farm, and he told her that his uncle was a Mevlevi dervish in Konya. And so the Colet people pricked up their ears, and Dr. Rolls sent 3 people over to Turkey to go and watch the ceremony which was taking place in Konya. And just to go into that story a little bit, you all probably know the history of the Mevlevi and Harumi lived in the 12th century. I'll tell you more about that later, and how it had continued as an unbroken tradition for over 700 years. And in Turkey, most towns had a Mevlevi teke, or a place where the dervishes got together to whirl. And after the First World War, the Ottoman Empire completely collapsed, and Kemal Ataturk, who had been a soldier in the Turkish army at Gallipoli, I think, he became the new ruler of Turkey, and he desperately wanted to move Turkey on. He thought it was too superstitious, and he wanted it to become a modern Western nation. So I think it was in 1925 he introduced a law that banned all fortune tellers, all dervish orders, and anything which he felt was holding Turkey back. So all the Mevlevi tekes overnight were all closed down. So it's like your teke upstairs is suddenly the doors are locked and big padlocks are put on. And if you turned, after that you could go to prison. So all the poor Mevlevi dervishes in 1925 all had to go underground. So they carried on turning. They used to do it behind drawn curtains on their living room carpets. And then in the late 1950s, the Turkish government started allowing it to start again, but just on the condition that it wasn't a religious ceremony, but it was a tourist attraction. And it happened around the time known as Shebi Aris, which is the 17th of December, which celebrates Rumi's death, or his union with the beloved. And so the Colet members went out at that time to one of the new demonstrations in Konya, and while they were sitting in the audience, they caught the eye of the sheikh who was looking after the ceremony. And I can tell you, as a sheikh, looking at the audience, you can tell exactly who's awake and who's asleep. You can see who's engaged and who's nodding off. It becomes very obvious. And Mr. Rezawi, as he was named, Rezawi Beykara, he spotted these three Colet people in the audience, and he talked to them after the ceremony, and they asked him would he be prepared to come over to London and teach for Mevlevi turning in London. And Mr. Rezawi, he went to talk to his sheikh, and his sheikh was a man named Munir Chelebi of Afyon. And Munir Chelebi was a direct descendant of Rumi. And he went away and said his prayers, and he asked Rumi in his prayers should he send Mr. Rezawi to London to teach the Mevlevi turning here. And the answer came back strongly, yes, you must go. So then Mr. Rezawi came over here in 1963 and he was a civil servant, so he only had a month's holiday, and he trained 60 people during that month to turn, and they all had great sewing parties in this room because they all had to sew all the robes from scratch. And Mr. Rezawi brought a set of robes over with him, and the Colet people all got busy copying them, and so by the end they had 60 robes, and they made all the hurkas which you're wearing today. Some of the ones we wear are still the original ones, which were made in that 4 weeks. And by the end of that 4 weeks, he had a big makabale for the people he'd trained, and ever since then it's carried on as a continued tradition here. And he was very radical, because when he came over, he taught the turning to both men and women, whereas in Turkey at that time it was only taught to men. And a bit later, women had to turn separately in Turkey. But now I notice in some tekkes in Istanbul, again like us, you have both men and women turning together. So when Mr. Rezawi went back to Turkey, he got into a bit of trouble with some of the fundamentalists. But so he was a very far-seeing man. I met him on a few occasions. He seemed, on the exterior, he seemed quite fierce, and in his training and teaching, he was quite fierce. He has been known to chase dervishes round the practice room with a stick. And so that then became another part of the Colet tradition, the Mevlevi. And a little known fact is when Mr. Uspensky in 1940 was leaving for America to escape the war, the people in London said, "But Mr. Uspensky, what shall we do when you've gone?" And he just said, "Read the Mevlevi," which was Rumi's great epic poem. And at that time the Mevlevi had just recently been published in a complete translation. And I read it all the way through when I was 20, and it is an amazing non-dual manuscript. And the actual Mevlevi teaching is so, in my opinion, it's amazingly non-dual and complete. And as I'll explain later, the whole ceremony is like an illustrated book of the teaching. So if you're not a reading person, you don't need to read any books. All you need to do is just turn in the ceremony, and gradually the knowledge comes to you in a non-verbal way. But if you've got an active mind and you want to hear things, then the Mevlevi is a wonderful read. Though again, it's quite difficult in some of its translations. But Rumi is just so brilliant at getting the essence of it and just picking it out. So now we're in the 1960s, and you've got these three sort of different traditions have come together. So you've got the tradition coming from Uspensky and Gurdjieff, which probably goes back to Neoplatonism. So that's like the Western mystical tradition. Then you've got the Advaita Vedanta, which is very, very ancient, almost like an advisory tradition from India coming in. And then you've got the Mevlevi Dervish, which is part of the Islamic Sufi tradition coming in. And so it's become a bit like a melting pot. And Dr. Rolls, he died in 1982, and at first he was mostly teaching Uspensky, but then gradually, the more he learnt of Advaita, the more he began to understand the bottom-up and top-down approaches. So the more he gradually turned everything around. And when I came along in about 1971, there was a little Uspensky, but it was nearly all Advaita then. So it was much more a top-down teaching. And the society had several methods, because it had the Mevlevi Dervish tradition, the meditation from the Advaita tradition, and then there were the sacred dances which Gurdjieff had picked up on his travels. So there was a number of sort of different approaches. And then, right at the end of Dr. Rolls's life, and I witnessed this, he again started to see things completely differently. And during the last year of his life, I saw him getting very frustrated with us, because he'd seen something else, and he was trying to convey it to us, and we just weren't seeing it. And I witnessed this happening, and I sometimes used to go and stay with him, and we had some really good talks about it. And up till that point, Colet House had been what was known as an esoteric school, and it had been quite fierce and quite strict. And I heard him say, I want the Colet House of the future to be like a cell of self-knowledge, no longer the image of an esoteric school, but a place that people can come to for rest and refreshment, particularly the young, for whom life is very difficult today. And I also heard him say there's to be no more stamping on egos, because back in the Uspensky tradition there was a lot of sort of ego stamping, and he said that was absolutely a no-no. And one of the last things he ever said, this was the night before he had his final illness, and he died a few days later, he summed it all up. He said, "The need now is for simplicity. We have been habitually complicating everything. It is only necessary to be quiet and to keep things simple. We have had everything upside down and back to front. There is only one consciousness. The levels are levels of impediment to that consciousness. Everything is that consciousness. that is what we have to feel and know. And then he died, and then we were left to carry on. And that, for me, what he'd said there became like a sort of Zen koan, because I knew he'd discovered something new, and I wanted to find out what it was he'd discovered and what he really wanted. And so in the years following that, so that was through the 80s and into the 90s, it became the most amazing sort of journey of discovery, as more and more layers of what he wanted and how he wanted it became apparent. And gradually we moved away from the esoteric school, and it became much more as it is now, where it is just a friendly society where people come to get rest and refreshment, and these different methods are all available, like meditation and dervish turning and other things. So in a way we've developed it, and I think the knowledge of itself has naturally turned around in the way that Dr. Rolls wanted it. Because where he said everything is consciousness, he was quite ahead of his time back then, because that was 1982 when he said that. And you didn't really start getting the non-dual neo-adviting teachers didn't really start appearing till about the year 2000, and people like Eckhart Tolle and Tony Parsons didn't really emerge at the earliest about 1996. So then by the year sort of the early 2000s, almost everyone was saying that everything is consciousness. So it was like Dr. Rolls' message had come of age. So my particular interest was both seeing that Mr. Uspensky had seen something different, and he tried to get us to understand it, but people had a job understanding it. And then Dr. Rolls saw something different. And I feel it's now 35 years since Dr. Rolls died. I really do feel now that the society is as Dr. Rolls wanted it, and I feel that the knowledge is as Uspensky also wanted it, that it's virtually been completely turned around. So in the next few meetings I'll make an effort to just describe very simply what non-dualism is, and what seeing from top down is, and how it works in a very practical way, and how it makes a difference to your life. But we're all so different, and we're all so individual, but there's as many approaches to accessing your true nature as there are individuals in the world. So everyone's approach is totally unique and individual. So if I say anything you don't agree with or don't believe, just don't believe me, because there's no reason why you should believe me. But I'll just explain it in the way I've experienced it, and how I've been helped to see it by Dr. Rolls and others. So is there any questions on any of that?
It's like a fundamental question about the non-duality and the top-down approach that you were talking about. My question is that when you look at it this way, that everything is one consciousness, so everything actually becomes obsolete. So how come one person's effort to become, because when you were looking at it the other way, there was something somewhere to get to, right? So you make effort, so you have some sort of motivation to do things. Like if let's say you're in a bad you have bad habits, so you need some sort of motivation to get you there. But if you look at it the
I
other
know
way,
what you're saying. That's a really good question. Can I answer it next week? Next week I'm going to explain it. I don't want to go into detail this week, because I'm just giving you your history lesson, and time is limited. But it's such a perfect question, that, because it relates to what's known as absolute and relative knowledge. Because I won't explain too much, but just with most self-respecting teachers, they give out two types of knowledge. They give relative and absolute. And relative knowledge is what's known as knowledge for the purposes of training. So that assumes that you perceive yourself as a separate individual out in life, and desperately, as you trying to get somewhere and trying to overcome your habits which you don't like. So for that, you're given relative knowledge. So it's as if you aren't separate, but you think you are. So you're given knowledge that applies to you being separate, and that knowledge helps you to realise that you're already not separate. So that's relative knowledge. So you might give certain exercises to do that relate to your apparent separation. Later on, in your own experience, you'll realise that you're not separate, that you're just the total oneness. You're not even a part of the oneness, you're the totality of the oneness. And then you have absolute knowledge, because you'll see it from the point of view of oneness. So it's like there's a process of leading someone out of apparent separation, so you're given relative knowledge, into seeing the full unity, which is absolute knowledge. I'll explain it in more detail, but
That makes sense,
that's the principle of it.
So there is a time
There's
for
a
us
time.
to get the absolute truth.
Yeah, there's a time for relative and
If it's too
absolute.
soon, you may misinterpret it in a different way.
Yeah.
So I'm okay.
Yeah.
What's the fuss about?
Yeah.
Everything is one, so why
A lot-
are we trying, right?
Yeah. A lot of teachers teach in parable and metaphor. And the great thing about a teaching story or a parable is it's multi-leveled. So you'll get it according to your particular understanding, and then in a year or two you'll see it completely differently, and then you'll see it differently again. And it's like there's all these multiple layers within the metaphors. So that's why people like Harumi again use endless stories and metaphors. So it has all these layers within it. But as I'll explain next week, the actual non-dual teaching it's so devastatingly simple that almost everyone misses it, because we want something very obscure and special. So in Zen, for instance, if someone asks what is the nature of the Buddha, the Zen master will say it's the head of a dead cat, which then completely confuses the person asking the question, but it's actually a literal fact, because everything is equally it. It isn't over there, it's right here. But it's this wonderful process in the dance of life. But I'll go into all that next week when we talk about non-dualism. I don't want to keep you too long.
Dr. Rose wrote Right Amy's book, even with the other name.
Dr. Rolls,
Yeah.
he wrote several books. They were mostly, rather him than actually sitting down and writing them, they were mostly recordings of lectures he gave, which he then sort of added more bits to. So there was one, when I was at school, I was 14, and I wrote a poem in the school magazine, which found its way to Dr. Rolls, and I got sent this book out of the blue called Waking Up, which he'd written, and that sort of became my Bible. Then he wrote another one called A Lasting Freedom. So those were his two sort of main books, but they weren't great big books, they were sort of very small little books.
Does Idris Shah have any connection at all to Colet House?
He doesn't actually. I've no sort of knowledge, I've no direct experience of Idris Shah. I know, just for the record, that Mr. Rezui didn't really approve of him, because he said, and again I've no direct knowledge of that, this is just Mr. Rezui talking, he said that Idris Shah used some quite highfalutin titles for himself, whereas he said a true dervish is a very humble person. But I've read quite a few of Idris Shah's books of dervish stories, and they're lovely books. I know Mr. Ezri himself wasn't impressed by Idris Shah, but I've never met him, so I can't say. His books are nice.
What is the first name of Dr. Rolls?
Francis Rolls. He was, here he is, here. That was him playing the role of Sheikh. So when I learnt to turn, he was the Sheikh. And he was the only Christian at the time who had been granted permission to wear the green ribbon or Death Star of the Mevlevi Sheikh. And that was honour bestowed on him by Munir Chalabi, the Rumi descendant. And I loved Dr. Rolls because he was very naughty and funny, and he emanated something. And I always felt very happy when I was near him. Is there anything I've forgotten?
I have a question regarding Dr. Mr. Uspensky. He said am I right? He had a vague notion of non-dual advaita. Had he